So we're here today to talk about the funding that UBCM administers for Next Generation 911, specifically our move to application-based funding for the 2025 year. So a couple quick introductions. I just introduced myself, Tanita Welch. I'm the manager for local government program services here at UBCM, and I'm very lucky to be joined by Yvonne. Yvonne, if you want to give yourself a quick introduction, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you, Danita. So, Ivan Rincon, I am the Executive Director of Projects for the Connectivity Division with the Ministry of Citizen Services. And my role currently is supporting UBCM in all aspects of the grant that is supporting Next Gen 911.
Thank you. So before we get going, I would like to acknowledge my personal gratitude to be living and working on the traditional unceded territory of the Lowcunguin and Wasanich peoples. For me, those are the people currently represented by the Esquimalt and Songhees Nation. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit of the overall background for this funding stream. Some of you may recall that the funding was offered from an allocation perspective about just over a year ago. And then we're going to spend most of our time talking about the new application-based program. There's some sub-bullets there that you can see some of the pieces we're going to talk about, a little bit of additional information in terms of some contacts and some other resources out there. And then I suspect we're going to have a fair amount of time for questions, which is usually where we kind of get the richer parts of these webinars. So that's great. So then just a few pieces, as I said, around housekeeping. So we are recording this webinar and we will be posting the recording and the slide deck on our website after. And I believe we're able to email out a link to participants today, or those folks that registered. We'll be using the Q&A function for any questions. So if you have questions at any time, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A. I'm having a bit of a technical challenge on my computer in that I can't see the Q&A, but some other staff here are hopefully going to be helping me out as questions come in. I'm not quite sure what's happening on my end, so apologies for that if we end up a little bit behind on some of the Q&A questions. Just so you know, we have disabled the chat. So if you do see that at the bottom of your screen, it will not be working for the purpose of this webinar. Although Claudia, who's our program administrator, is able to send out messages to the participants today. So she can share links, etc. But participants are not able to use the chat. And then finally, if you have any challenges with the Q&A, if you're having any technical glitches like I am, you are able to raise your hand from the function at the bottom of your screen. And when you do so, again, Claudia will be able to unmute your line and you could ask your question verbally instead of using the Q&A if you are having any challenges there. So let's talk a little bit about the funding stream, how we got started, and what we're intending to do with the funding. So going back to February 2023, some of you again will recall that there were two significant contributions of funding from the province. 60 million came to UBCM. Under that, we allocated just shy of $36.5 million to eligible recipients for our allocation-based funding program. So that saw every local government and every modern Treaty First Nation in BC receive base funding. And then there was additional funding for primary and secondary PSAPs and some of the municipally run OCCs, RCMP OCCs in the province. It leaves us with approximately 25 million to consider under the application-based funding. And then the other portion of the funding that came out in February 2023 was the 90 million that went directly to ECOM. So two very distinct pots of money with two very distinct purposes. For our side of money, for the 60 million that we administer, the overall intent, supporting local preparedness, for the implementation of Next Gen 911. So that's really the piece around base funding. That's really the focus of local preparedness. And then to support eligible recipients, to support transition and operational readiness of the existing 911 services to Next Gen 911, of course, in compliance with the CRTC mandate. It's helpful to kind of just to pause there and just say out loud that and Yvonne, please jump in if you want to add to this. You know, we're well aware that the milestones and the intended timelines of the national movement to Next Gen 911 have been somewhat in flux, and that there are still some pieces where there is a lack of clarity. And so we do say in our program guide, and we've kind of been saying all along, that if the CRTC changes the timelines again, if the goalposts shift, that we are prepared to be more nimble in things like report deadlines for both the allocation-based funding and the upcoming application-based funding. So let's just dig right into it. What's going to happen with application-based funding? So if anyone tried to look ahead and get going, you realize the intake doesn't actually open until November 1st. So as you can get the program guide off our website, it's been posted since about late August, but the actual application process won't go live until November 1st. It will stay open until February 14th, which happens to be my birthday, so that'll be a little bit of a gift for me. Um, so the process, anybody familiar with the granting we do here at UBCM, we transitioned to a hybrid process about a year ago. So we have an online application tool. You'll be able to go in, initiate your application online, and that tool limits the applicants to only those communities that are eligible in the province, those applicants that are eligible. And once you complete that step, you'll receive an email with a summary of what you've submitted, and then also the worksheet that needs to be submitted. So step one is really the generic information that any applicant would need to submit for any of our funding programs. And step two, which is the worksheet, is the information you'll need to provide specific to the Next Gen 911 funding stream. So the specific proposed activities, budget, etc., that you're interested in putting forward for consideration. This is application based, so unlike our first round of funding, which was allocation based, all applications will be scored. We expect that the intake will be competitive. We build all of our grant programs with the assumption that they may need to be competitive. So we do have tools to score and adjudicate based on that assumption. And then we'll be doing our best, and we're usually pretty good at hitting our milestones of advising all applicants of the status of their application within 90 days of February 14th. So March, April, May. So kind of early in the spring, folks should be getting their response letters to their funding applications. So grant maximums. As I said, we have about 25 million left in the fund. So we are following kind of the same categories that we had under under allocation-based funding. So we're looking at base funding, this time calling it additional base funding, up to $100,000. Primary PSAPs, of which there are only 2 in the province, up to 2 million. Eligible secondary PSAPs, again 2 million, and then the eligible OCCs, which are just the municipally run OCCs, up to $500,000. So the amounts can be combined. So if you are a community, for example, Prince Rupert, and you have a primary PSAP, you could be looking to apply for up to 2.1 million because you'd be eligible for base funding and the primary PSAP funding. So you can kind of see how all those examples play out. But just so folks understand that if you are a community that is running a PSAP or an OCC, you are eligible to apply for the base and the PSAP funding. So that's what those formulas, sort of really kind of basic math there, are meant to demonstrate. So who's eligible to apply? Local governments, so that's all municipalities and regional districts in the province. Treaty First Nations, so modern Treaty First Nations, and also Indigenous national governments with the authority for lands and resources. A little bit different than allocation-based funding. And again, those of you that are familiar with any of our other funding programs, we do have the concept of regional projects. So two or more eligible applicants can submit a single application for a collaborative project. In those moments, funding maximums essentially multiply by the number of eligible applicants, with the understanding that we do expect cost efficiencies to come in regional projects. We don't often approve projects that are sort of just, 5 eligible applicants, 5 times the maximum, because there are cost efficiencies that are generally realized when communities work together. So again, different from allocation-based funding, there is the ability for regional projects this time around that might be attractive, for some regional districts where you have member municipalities, where you are providing service. Maybe that's around mapping and GIS, and it makes sense for the regional district to apply and the member municipalities to be sub-applicants. Eligible activities, we're going to dig into this a little bit more, and I'm sure Yvonne will have more to say because he is by far the technical expert on this side of it. But what actual activities are we funding? Again, those of you who have received allocation-based funding will see that it's pretty much the same. So everything that was eligible under allocation-based funding is eligible under application-based funding. So we're moving all of those activities forward. One piece that's really important to understand is that if you are going to apply for application-based funding, you need to be able to provide a really clear and distinct division between what activities you were undertaking with allocation-based funding and what you're going to undertake with application-based funding. We need to understand that, they're distinct phases of a project, and that's to be sure that, activities aren't showing up under two funding sources. We're happy to have that chat with anybody, if they want to give us a call between now and February to kind of talk through what that looks like. It's interesting to note, we haven't received a single claim or report for allocation-based funding. So nobody's reported out on any activities so far. We will be sending out some reminders and not too long to everybody who received allocation-based funding, as a reminder of the process for either claims or final reporting. But if you are undertaking activities under allocation-based funding and intending to apply for application-based funding, really do think through how you're going to present those as distinct projects. So what are we actually funding? So additional base funding, these are all of the same activities that you would have seen under allocation-based funding. My intent wasn't to spend much time on these. Yvonne, please jump in if you have anything you want to add on any of these. So again, the base funding was really aimed at the local preparedness. So how do you prepare your community for this transition to Next Gen 911? It's not about the bells and whistles and the software and the hardware you need to actually run the system. It's about how do you actually prepare your community under that local preparedness bucket. So public education, legal and contract. Mapping and GIS has probably been by far the most common and potentially confusing area for local governments under the allocation-based funding so far. So we certainly had lots of inquiries around mapping and GIS over the last year or so. And then also training. In our program guide, some of the examples we give for training could be with, organizations in your community, local agencies that are most likely to need to make 911 calls. So it could be organizations working with unsheltered populations, volunteers doing search and rescue. So those are some of the examples that we had brought back to us.
I can add something,
Great.
Danita, to the mapping and GIS. So as Danita says, we have had a lot of questions around that, and some of the things that you will see in the guide, if you compare that to the original guide, is that we kind of extended a little bit more the concepts around what mapping and GIS means, because it's not only the technical aspects of that or the actual actions of building maps, is actions that are needed. So for example, there's a couple of things here like changing names, things like that to roads that are needed in order to make sure that the new data sets that are going to be used in NextGen 911 when they are required comply with the standards that are coming, and also that they make sense within the context of the geographical locations that will be served by the NextGen 911 service provider, right? So we have been extending, and that's basically based on a lot of questions that we receive and a lot of interesting queries about, okay, well, is this covered or not? So we kind of extended a little bit more the general concept of what mapping and GIS means for the context of this project.
Mhm. Thanks for that. And a good segue, because the other piece we've extended is the inclusion of requests for civic addressing and signage that are specific to NextGen 911. So this is a departure from allocation-based funding. This portion does not exist in allocation-based funding. It is only going to be in application-based funding, because we did feel that this was a category that does need to be vetted by the review team, just to make sure that anything proposed under this section does have a meaningful connection to the transition to next gen 911 and is not sort of otherwise sort of, general emergency preparedness or community safety. So some examples here, some signage for standardizing road names with your data sets, um, getting lat long geolocation established, signage to convert local names. So again, as Yvonne was saying, your data set may say one thing, but your community signage may say another. Um, and then basically, a catch-all at the end, any other signage that is supporting compliance with the standards that are existing for or will exist for Next Gen 911. Again, we're happy to jump on a call, chat through this once the application portal opens and communities are starting to work on their applications to sort of give some further guidance around what would be considered under this and what wouldn't be. Moving on then from the additional base funding. So as I already said, everybody, all local governments, all Treaty First Nations are eligible for base funding. Primary and secondary PSAP funding is only for those communities that operate a primary or a secondary PSAP. So you can see, the pieces that are eligible. I didn't list everything here because it's a very long, very specific list of technical pieces, software, hardware, um, and other IT requirements or IM requirements for Next Gen 911. So please do refer to Table 1 in the program guide. A couple pieces of clarity that I will provide is when it comes to hardware, software, and equipment, we are talking about the purchase, the upgrade, and the installation for those three pieces. So we had a lot of questions actually around upgrading software and upgrading hardware. So we wanted to provide certainty that purchase, upgrade, and installation are all eligible. Also that primary and backup sites are eligible because that question also came up a handful of times. And then you see the other categories, so change management, looking at, sort of training and leadership training around change management, business continuity, how do you move from analog to next gen 911 and keep your system running? And then the balance are more or less the pieces that are under base funding, so training, mapping, JS, legal, but then adding in the in collaboration with Indigenous communities, and then governance of PSAPs. So all of those pieces, again, if your community is one of the ones in the province that operate primary and secondary PSAPs, you are eligible to apply for these pieces as well. Again, keeping in mind that we're going to need to clearly see what you've spent for allocation-based funding, what you propose to spend, and how that aligns with application-based funding. We did also make a couple enhancements for primary and secondary PSAPs. Maybe I'll let Yvonne speak to these because, again, knows so much more than I do, but cybersecurity and then sort of the other pieces of hardware and software.
Yeah, thank you, Danita. So yeah, so one of the things that we've been discovering through this process from the time when the original grants were allocated is that the local government agreements that are required for Next Gen 911 have very strict requirements on the cybersecurity side of things. So even though it was kind of mentioned in the original documents as one line item, we now know more and we know what those requirements look like, right? So what we decided was to be a little bit more, again, open on the kind of things that are related to cybersecurity. So we have things like assessments of the current situation. Some people call these security and threat risk assessments, which are very common in the cybersecurity world. Um, Planning and designing of cybersecurity components. Most of the sites that we know of that are currently on the 911 system, the traditional 911 system, will have to be revamped on the security side of things. So that requires typically engagement from consultants that really know cybersecurity at this level. So that is something that will also be included. And there are certain standards that have to be followed. One of them is called NCIT 2.0, which is again very strict. So we're talking about homeland security level kind of thing. So we know that there will be, especially for primary and secondary PSAPs, costs incurred on this, right? So we are I know, being a little bit more open on what is required. And as Danita said on the previous item, if you have any questions around this, just drop us an email and we'll be able to discuss this. But I'm gonna say that from the general sense, anything that smells cybersecurity will probably be covered under the grants.
Thanks, Yvonne. Looking then to OCC funding. So again, I mean, you're going to sort of sense the trend here that a lot of the eligible activities cascade from one category to the next. Again, all the details are in table 1 of the program guide. The one piece I wanted to really highlight for the OCCs is that unlike primary and secondary PSAPs, there are no eligible activities or eligible expenditures in relation to hardware, software, or any equipment purchases, with the exception of call handling devices. So it is a little bit different than primary and secondary PSAPs. So most of the other categories on the softer side, change management, business continuity, etc., are consistent throughout primary, secondary PSAPs and OCCs. But there are no eligible expenditures related to hardware, software, or equipment, again, like I said, except for call handling devices, if you are one of the municipalities operating a RCMP OCC, of which there's only 3, I think, that are eligible. So just a quick flag of some additional information, and then we're going to go right to questions, because that's usually where we get a lot more value out of webinars. And certainly feel free, that was sort of a quick and dirty overview. So feel free to get your questions in there, or like we said, reach out to UBCM afterwards. So link there for our website. Again, this is going to be, the slide deck's going to be available, so those links will be live, or Claudia, if you're available, we can drop them into the chat so folks can see them. So this is where you'll find the program guide, the UBCM website, and as of November 1st, it's also where you'll link to our application portal. So that's where you'll be able to go in and initiate your application. The NextGen 911 GeoHub is a great resource. So there's an email address, and when we send this out, we'll get I see the link has vanished, but when we send this out, we'll get the link live again for the GeoHub. So, really any questions around mapping and GIS data requirements for NextGen 911 all exists in the GeoHub. So that is a fantastic resource, and we'd encourage any applicants with questions around some of the technical requirements, etc., to go chat with those folks. And then again, if you do want to chat with UBCM directly, and if there are any sort of local conversations that make sense to have more of a technical expert, we'll pull Yvonne into those chats as he's available. But give us a call. Our phone number's there, and our email address is there as well. I do see that we've got some questions rolling into the Q&A. I can see the Q&A now, which is great. So why don't we jump into a few of those? Question from ICI Society. Hi, Steve. Nice to see you here. Considering the ICI Society's previous involvement in the 5G pilot project and the current BC aggregator trial, can the society apply for funding if we partner with an eligible organization? It's a yes and no answer, and we can certainly chat more offline. UBCM doesn't have authority to issue grants to anybody other than approved or eligible applicants. So that's local governments, Treaty First Nations, and Indigenous national governments. Um, you wouldn't be able to be an applicant or a sub-applicant, but if you are a third party that a local community hires as a technical resource, then our grant recipients hire subject matter experts and technical advisors and consultants, et cetera, as needed on all of our funding programs. So um, that might be an option, and certainly happy to talk more about that one offline. The second question is mapping and GIS covered under the initial funding for municipalities? So if your question is it covered under base funding? Yes, it is. If you have a look at, and I'm just looking down because I'm looking at the program guide myself, but if you have a look at page 4, top of page 4 of the program guide, mapping and GIS is an eligible category under additional base funding. And the examples we include are mapping and GIS readiness assessments, improvements related to boundary disputes, out-of-date place names, road names, indigenous place names, and then mapping or GIS software licenses, provided the license is dedicated to NextGen 911 or the cost is prorated. So if you're planning to buy software that your whole municipality will use, then you kind of have to do a bit of an estimate of how much of that would actually be dedicated to NextGen 911. And maybe that's 40%, maybe that's 60%, and just assign that portion of the cost to the grant request. Yvonne, I'm going to let you answer the next one. Can you see the
Yeah,
Q&A? Okay,
yeah,
good.
I can see it, and that's an easy answer. Does that, I guess that is the security funding, include privacy impact assessments, or PIS as we call it, and security assessments? The answer is yes. That's exactly what it covers, in addition to all the other things that we have. So yeah, they're covered under the eligible expenses.
Great. And you know what? I'm just going to keep handing them over to you. Do you want to answer our next one around First Nation eligibility?
Yeah, so I would say that's we have to work on that one because it's another yes or no answer. So if we go to what is currently in place in the ecosystem on 911 services, there are no First Nations that actually offer or have services under the current status of the agreements of the 911 services, which it doesn't mean that in the future that is going to be like that, right? And we already know that there are some First Nations that are in contact with their regional districts to try to get certain things sorted out on things like GIS and so on and so forth, right? So for now, and that's more linked to the way that the grants are awarded, there is no, except for the ones that Danita mentioned in her presentation, there is no provision for First Nations to actually apply for funding. However, in most cases that we know of, a lot of the work is being done in conjunction with regional districts and in some cases municipalities. So my comment will be, if there's a way to actually bring together the different parties involved in these discussions of what is needed for to supply 911 services to First Nations or in First Nations territories, the first step will be to actually talk to those entities that currently are offering the 911 services or 911 related services, right? So that's the comment that I can make around that.
Thanks, Yvonne. I see one more question in the Q&A, which we will get to in just a second. Just to remind you, if you're having any challenges with the Q&A, you can raise your hand as a function of the Zoom webinar, and we'd be happy to have questions asked verbally as well. Otherwise, please keep adding your questions into the Q&A here, and we will answer as many as we can. So our next question is, what is your definition of a secondary PSAP? Municipal OCCs are a secondary PSAP, so it's unclear why they would not qualify for the secondary PSAP funding. Can you clarify? I can take the first half of it, and Yvonne, you can take the second if you
Go ahead.
want.
Yeah.
So when we came up with allocation-based funding, and I would encourage you to have a look at the allocation-based funding guide from 2023, because we built a very fulsome appendix which didn't seem to exist in any other public locations that we could find, in that we listed every local government in the province and defined how their primary, call answer this is being handled in their community. So if you look at that appendix, and again, I'm just looking down because I have it in front of me, you know, we indicated who's eligible for base funding, how their 911 call answer is currently managed. You'll see a lot of that. You just kind of flow down. It's e-com, in a lot of these. Um, and then we looked at where communities are receiving their secondary, PSAP, their fire dispatch from. And based on that, in terms of who's actually providing secondary PSAP fire dispatch, the 6 PSAPs were identified in, kind of early 2023 when we were doing this work. And then I'll let Yvonne answer the question around OCCs and why they're different and considered different from a funding perspective.
Yeah, the OCCs are basically the ones that are run by the RCMP. So that is specific name that they use. So I mean, they're technically secondary PSAP. So the person who asked the question is correct. So it is a secondary PSAP, but those are OCCs are PSAPs, secondary PSAPs or dispatch centers run directly by the RCMP. So that's the difference.
Mhm.
And the reason why they're different from the funding perspective is because the RCMP is actually providing funding as part of their own Next Gen 911 project. So their cost allocation is a little bit like shared. So there are certain differences as to what things are eligible. So as Danita said, when we were doing the exercise a year and a half ago, we kind of had to come back with a number, given what we knew, and the specific needs of OCCs were different to those of the other secondary PSAPs, which are basically fire dispatch centers.
And sort of an add-on to that comment is, if you do look at the program guide under ineligible activities, we did want to be very clear that any activity or cost that's being funded by ECOM, the RCMP, or the BC Emergency Health Services are not eligible under this grant. And so some of there was a secondary PSAP that was in the process of transitioning to working to being a full ECOM facility. So we understand that there's shift and there's movement out there in terms of how some of these services are governed or operated. So that one happened to shift. And so now that it's being managed and operated by ECOM, it's not eligible under this funding stream. Because this funding stream is here to help those that aren't, fully being funded or supported via ECOM. So there's a generic kind of question at the
Mm.
end here. Well, not at the end. Um, the question is kind of more about what would be kind of more the CRTC timelines. So when will video calls happen? Yvonne, do
I,
you have
yeah,
any?
yeah. I mean, there's like a general question, but the last comment in the question is actually interesting to address. So yeah, the timing for services, additional services or new services on the Next Gen 911 system varies. Um, Texting, for example, or what we call RTT, which means real-time texting, is one of the base services that will be offered as soon as Next-Gen 911 is working. So again, as Danita was saying at the beginning, the dates are in flux. So right now is March 2025, but it will be probably removed. So we don't know exactly when it happens, but it is a base services, right? Video calls is a little bit of a different service because it requires the technical capabilities will be there, but it requires some other standards that are not in place right now. So there's some estimates around when that will be available, and it is probably most likely around 2 to 3 years after the Next Gen 911 services are launched, right? So let's say if it's 2025, 2026, we're talking about 2028, 2029, when people will be able to call using video calls, right? But the comment at the end is interesting because one of the things that we are allowing within the context of the grants is public education, right? Because we know that this will be a change in the way that the communities will interact with the 911 system. And I'm pretty sure that ECOM and 911 service providers like ambulance and police services and so on will have certain campaigns, but there is also, we can foresee that communities will probably require some work around that, and this is something that is eligible under the grants.
We have had, I mean, just to sort of throw another question at you, Yvonne, we have had, so when I was at convention for UBCM last month, a few people asked me, is there going to be a provincial education campaign? Is there going to be a consolidated education campaign where everybody in the province will get the same information and local communities could use that, and take on the cost of adding it to their own websites or adding it to their own newsletters or whatever it might be, but so that all the messaging is consistent and vetted and verified by, PCSG or PSG or citizen services.
PSSG.
Yeah.
So the short answer is we don't have anything like that right now in the books. But I am sure that that will be one of the discussion points. So right now, and probably everybody in this call knows this, public safety is mostly a municipal responsibility. But we also understand that there has to be, as Danita is saying, some consistency around messaging and so on and so forth, right? So I think that there are certain examples, like for example, the campaigns that emergency management runs on earthquakes and then fire safety and things like that, that will serve as an example. Those are, I'm just gonna say, easy to do because emergency management is its own ministry, so they have the resources and the ability to do that as part of their regular day-to-day operations. Because 911 has always been at the municipal level. There's nothing right now today in the for example in the PSSG ministry to actually drive or derive this kind of work from. But I will be surprised if down the road there's not something like this, right? So the short answer is not today, but it's probably something that down the line is going to be in place.
Thanks. Thank you for indulging me, putting you on the spot with my own questions. Last question I'm seeing, which is a short answer, which is the list of municipalities on the website. So the list is the appendix to the 2023 allocation-based funding guide. So it is Appendix 2. It is many pages long. It makes the guide very long. It lists, as we said, and it's divided up by regional district. So it lists every regional district, municipality, and then as discussed, modern Treaty First Nations as well. And then, yeah, provides at least, when this was developed at the moment in time of sort of, late spring, summer 2023, how communities are managing 911 call answer and fire dispatch. So have a look at the 2023 allocation-based program guide, and it's in the appendix. So I'm going to put out a final call for questions. Reminder that anybody can raise their hand if they'd like to ask something verbally. Otherwise, just again, a further reminder that slide deck and recording will be available soon. You will get an email. The intake opens November 1st. Program guides live now if you want to go in and have a look. And Yvonne and I are happy to set up as many calls as we need to walk folks through what this is going to look like between now and mid-February. So everyone who's interested in submitting an application is supported to do so.